Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen recently visited Beijing, where she had such substantive and productive talks with high-level officials there. However, the fact that China tightened its controls over exports of two materials that are crucial to manufacturing chips just days before Yellen's visit, and Yellen herself admitted that the two countries still had significant disagreements, shows their rivalry is not going to see an end soon. How do experts forecast such tensions to develop, and how could they affect South Korea? For an in-depth analysis, we invite Professor Kim Sei-wan from Ewha Womans University. Professor Kim, welcome.
Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. And we also have Andy Moak, Senior Research Fellow at the Center of China and Globalization. Andy, good to see you.
Great to be with you.
All right, now first question to our Professor Kim. Now, let's first talk about the chip war between China and the U.S. This chip war, as far as I know, started last October. Could you briefly outline how it has developed up until now?
Yes. First of all, U.S. government sees that the semiconductor or chip is the key that determines the fortune of U.S. economy related to development of the first wave industrial revolution like artificial intelligence, IoT, and self-driving car, and so on. United States still is located actually at the frontiers of research and development, components and equipments in chip production. But actual manufacturing of non-memory chips and memory chips are dominated by Korean and Taiwanese corporations like Samsung Electronics and TSMC. Given this situation, China, which is the second mover in chip industry, has been rising quickly in chip production technology thanks to Beijing's huge and aggressive support. But U.S. wants to construct its own chip production chain only with Korea, Taiwan, and Japan by excluding China. So U.S. Congress passed the Chips and Science Act in August 2022, which gives serious restrictions on Chinese chip development and production. And recently, China is retaliating with ban of Micron, which is U.S. corporations' chip sales in China, and controlling key materials used in chip production, like germanium and gallium.
Right. Now let's also talk about, China's this most recent retaliatory move. Andy, China's latest move restricts the exports of gallium and germanium, as our Professor Kim said, from the very start of August. Now, first of all, what are these materials and what are the details of this export control?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. I think we first have to look a little bit of historical context here. So China has long sought to have a cooperative relationship with the U.S., but because of these increasingly escalatory and provocative actions, including these bans and restrictions on semiconductors, as we've just heard, China has really shifted its approach based on its understanding, which I believe is an accurate understanding of the prevailing power dynamics. So China has decided now that if the U.S. can't see the light in terms of working cooperatively with China, it will make the U.S. feel the heat. And this is what leads us to these looming restrictions on gallium and germanium. So semiconductors, we know, are very important for an economy, for a country's military, pretty much any application we can think of. And both gallium and germanium are important inputs into semiconductors. Also, they're important inputs into solar panels, other EVs, other very important applications, including advanced radar. So when we look in particular at gallium, that it's used for advanced radar applications because of its ability to work under high power, high frequency, high temperature scenarios. So this is a calibrated response by China, but also I think it's a very important recent example, but not the only one, of China taking a much more assertive stance in dealing with the U.S. as an equal. And again, looking that if the U.S. cannot see the light, China will make it feel the heat.
Right, I see. So they are key materials for high-tech sector indeed. Now, with China's such export control in place, Professor Kim, both the U.S. and the EU are assessing their exposure to these metals from China. How essential are these metals to the U.S. and its European allies? And what kind of follow-up measures do you believe will be put in place?
Beijing's export controls on two rare elements, gallium and germanium, are essential for manufacturing semiconductors, as Andy pointed out. And it is a very well-prepared retaliation after the United States and Europe restricted chip exports to China. Gallium and germanium are used in a variety of products, including chips and solar panels. Both are on the European Union's list of critical raw materials, which are deemed crucial to Europe's economy. That shows how much these materials are important for EU's industries. Since China is by far the world's biggest germanium gallium producer and exporter, both of US and EU can't find substitutes for China-produced rare earths. The market share of Chinese rare earth exceeds 60% in the global market. But in the long run, US and EU will try to find substitute in South Asian countries like Vietnam and South American countries like Brazil and Bolivia. It is known that these countries have rich deposits of rare earth, but they are not much developed yet.
I see. Now, Professor Kim, one more question. We have been talking about the impact on EU and the US, but since these materials are key to manufacturing semiconductors, South Korean chip makers could also be worried about this. How might South Korean chip makers be impacted?
I'm glad that you raised this issue, Bo-kyung. As of now, it is not clear that Beijing puts export control on the two rare materials to Korea. Beijing's rare earth restrictions comes just days after the Dutch government announced new restrictions on exports of some semiconductor equipments. It drew an angry response from Beijing because the new rules means that ASML, the only producer in the world of a key machine lithographer, is not allowed to export its products to China. It is a very practical restriction for China not to produce high-level chips. Japan and United States have also taken steps to limit Chinese companies' access to chips and chip-making equipments. But Beijing absolutely needs Korean corporations' chip production and technology in China. So it is expected that China is not subject to Beijing's two materials export control for a while. But if Korea also gives restrictions on China, like ban of top-notch chip export to China, Beijing would give similar restrictions on Korea.
Right, I see. We'll just have to wait and see what Beijing does. Now, Andy, I'd like to also tap on China's hidden intention here. Beijing's such controls on two critical minerals came just days before U.S. Treasury Chief Janet Yellen's arrival to China. What do you believe China's intention was?
Well, I think certainly there's a lot of talk that this could be seen as a bargaining chip in discussions with Secretary Yellen's visit. But I think we also need to look at it in the larger historical context as well. So if we go back to the early days of reform and opening, even then, Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders expressed concern and even suspicion that the United States would one day weaponize or misuse global public goods like the US dollar, like sea lanes of communication, access to technology to slow down or even reverse China's rise. So that suspicion, I think, has unfortunately been proven correct in the last few years, not only with these recent semiconductor restrictions, but look at the actions against Huawei earlier, the trade war launched by then
All right. It seems like we are having a slight technical glitch right now with our Andy. So before our Andy comes back, why don't I ask Professor Kim another question about China-U.S. rivalry here, and welcome back our Andy when he comes back. Now, Professor Kim, the Biden administration is preparing yet another new set of measures against China, including an executive order curbing U.S. outbound investment in the country. Now, could you tell us what the details are, and could we expect more, such measures by the U.S.?
Well, historians say that the U.S. and China rivalry is not an easy-ending game, but it can be lasted until the end of this century because it is a big collision of two different systems between U.S. and China. Biden administration already imposed restrictions on high-tech chip technology transfer to China through Chips and Science Act of August 2022. In addition, Biden administration aims to sign an executive order soon that will limit investment in key parts of Chinese economy by American businesses, which is a broader restriction than that of the Chips and Science Act of last year. United States have been briefing its G7 partners, actually including Korea, on the investment curves for high-tech industries to China. And they hope to get an endorsement from G7 members countries. G7 countries are not expected to announce similar restrictions at the same time. I think the likeliest sequence is for the executive order to be signed soon after that expression of international support from G7s.
Right, I see. So we'll just have to wait and see what kind of reaction comes from the G7 nations. But Professor Kim, I'd like to ask you this. That being said, since we all know that the U.S. is going to come up with many other new measures to curb China's rise, is it possible that China could perhaps roll out more countermeasures against U.S. export curbs, as was suggested by Beijing's former Minister of Commerce when speaking to China's daily?
Well, that's the tough question. All the experts on high-tech chips are saying that it is true that China needs U.S. and Korea and Taiwan's high-level technology to develop their chip industry. There's no question about it. But as of now, even though their chip technology and production level is not as good as that of the Korea and United States, as time goes by, they can develop their own technology in producing high-level chips. Some experts are saying that it will take generations, like 20 to 30 years, to have a U.S. or Korean level chip technology. But what I'm saying is, it is true that as time goes by pouring huge amount of investment on chip industries and chip production corporations by Beijing, the Chinese will have their own top-notch technology in the end.
Right, I see. Now, it seems Andy is back on. So, Andy, I'd like to ask you this question. We were talking about whether it is possible that China could roll out, more countermeasures against U.S. export curbs, as, there are many saying that Biden administration is preparing for an executive order curbing U.S. outbound investment in the country. What's your view on this?
I think the unfortunate reality is that there are potentially more steps that China could take. Again, unfortunately, we were cut off earlier, but I think the point for China is that it is always worried that the U.S. would weaponize important global public goods like the U.S. dollar, the global payment system, sea lines of communication, access to technology, and has recognized the need to take appropriate countermeasures. So a lot depends, I think, on how the U.S. continues. If it indeed continues down this increasingly escalatory path, that would certainly be bad for China.
Right. Unfortunately, it seems like we are having a not smooth connection right now, Andy. So why don't we ask Professor Kim for more questions for now and see if connection gets better. So Professor Kim, though differences in views remain and concerns do linger, Yellen and Lee Chang did point out that it is important that the two countries keep communicating and cooperating in areas such as, climate change. Do you believe they could overcome differences and work together in certain areas where cooperation is needed?
I think the private level and also government level cooperation between U.S. and China will be maintained in the future. I think the most important speech by Secretary Yellen in Beijing was the two big countries, U.S. and China, can't be decoupled for the global economy. That means they will maintain the high level communication between U.S. and China. And for that purpose, Secretary Yellen recognizes that without support and help of Chinese government, U.S. can't solve the problem of environment problem and the global chip war and broken production chain between countries and so on.
Right. Then Professor Kim, what also matters is, how this is going to impact South Korean economy, right? How do you believe it's going to impact, South Korean chip makers and also the economy in overall?
Actually, U.S. has all the technologies and high-tech chips and R&D power too. And based on these U.S.-originated technology, Korea is very specialized in chip manufacturing. But China is the largest at the same time buyer of Korean chips, more than 60% of total. We say that Korea is under a sandwich situation between U.S. and China's conflicts. In the middle of U.S. and China chip war, it is important for Korea not picking sides between U.S. and China. It is more important to have a strategy between the two countries. For example, if we take the China side, it will be very difficult to develop higher level chips with U.S. and there will be problems in procuring chip production equipments and materials. But if we take the U.S. side, we can lose the largest Korean chip buyer that buys more than 60% of Korean produced chips. So taking one side by 100% between U.S. and China is a very dangerous option to Korea. It is necessary to have a sensible strategy, I think, to partially satisfy both sides.
Right. I mean, I cannot agree more that South Korea is quite facing dilemma that it needs to it cannot choose either one side of the U.S. or China. In that sense, Professor Kim, what kind of suggestions would you like to propose to the Yoon administration right now? Because it seems like it is indeed facing dilemma of choosing one side right now.
Actually, Korean chip manufacturers has huge production facilities in China. They are producing a huge amount of high-tech chips in China, like Xi'an and so on. But the problem is, according to U.S. Chips and Science Act of last year, all the technology and equipments, U.S.-based originated technologies and equipments that enters China's should be checked by U.S. government. That means for updating Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix chip production facilities in Chinese territory, there should be something permission from U.S. government every year. This kind of problem can't be solved by company level, by Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix. It is Korean government that should be taking care of this kind of country level or government level problem with the United States for minimizing the economic pain or economic problem of these two major Korean chip producers. Government should be exercising its diplomatic power with the United States and China.
Right, I see. I can agree more. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Well, thank you, Professor Kim. And we're very sorry that we could not ask enough questions to our Andy because of this not smooth connection. But we hope to have better discussion later on with our Andy in the future. But Andy, thank you for your insights. We hope to see you again. We really appreciate it. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching. Sorry again. Goodbye.